Okay, I'm going to start. I have to have the microphone on to record it. So hopefully it's not too loud for you. Okay, so in this session on the Social Media Data and Society module, we're talking about privacy, surveillance and rights, and debates about these in relation to social media data mining. These are massive topics. You could do a whole module on one of these topics alone. So to cover all three of them in one lecture is to give you an overview of the main debates, okay? And then also hopefully with the references that I'll talk about and include at the end of the slides, you can then follow up some of these debates as you wish to. So when in the very first week, when I was kind of sketching out the way that the different focuses in social media research had changed, I pointed out that privacy is a major focus about in social media research, and that one of the core questions has been, does privacy still matter in an age of social media? And as I also pointed out in that early week, this is partly because of claims by people like Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, that privacy is no longer a social norm. So there's been a lot of criticism by academics and social media researchers of that assertion, and a lot of effort to prove that it's not true, that to prove that privacy does still matter. And one of the arguments that people have made is that Zuckerberg did this. He told us that privacy doesn't matter anymore to justify his company's controversial decision to change the privacy of people's Facebook accounts. So just as at a time when the default setting was to make a Facebook account less private and more public than it had previously been, Zuckerberg tells us that privacy doesn't matter anymore. So it's a kind of justification that the move that Facebook is making doesn't matter because privacy doesn't matter anymore. There is actually some scholarly research into how Zuckerberg talks about Facebook and why it matters. So it does matter because he's trying to set the agenda here. He's trying to tell us that we're not bothered about something that we used to be bothered about. And there's a reference in the reference list by Hoffman and others, which is about how Zuckerberg talks about Facebook and privacy. So we've got this kind of paradox, really, that on the one hand, he says privacy doesn't matter. On the other hand, academics say, yes, it does matter. And yet, on the other hand, there's a lot of sort of assertion that people don't appear to care about privacy. And I showed this article in the first week as well, which is, describes a young generation as a say everything generation, which is to imply that they don't care about privacy. They're happy to say everything on public facing social media platforms. So this is called the privacy paradox, which I'll say a bit more about later. But I think it's important to think about what we mean by privacy, and especially to think about the definitions that academics writing about social media and privacy have drawn on. So a lot of people draw on a definition from the 1960s by a legal scholar called Westin, and he defines privacy like this. He says it's the claim of individuals, groups or institutions to determine for themselves when, how and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. So impersonal information about yourself, or what we might also call personal data, is at the heart of Westin's definition of privacy that people draw on. So I'm just going to show you a couple more definitions that are kind of central to a lot of social media research, and I think they're all, making the same point in different ways. So there's a book by Helen Session2 called Privacy in Context, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. She draws on this definition by William Parran. So, who says privacy is the condition of not having undocumented personal knowledge about one possessed by others. A person's privacy is diminished exactly to the degree that others possess this kind of knowledge about him. So clearly here in social media data mining, we have a situation where personal data is shared to groups, organisations, companies we don't even know where it's shared. So based on these definitions, we have a diminishing of privacy through social media data mining. And again, this is about personal knowledge, personal information, which Parent defines as facts which most persons in a given society choose not to reveal about themselves except to close friends and family, or facts about which a particular individual is acutely sensitive. So there's a legal definition of personal data which refers to it as your name, date of birth, address, age. But actually, this is a kind of a looser definition of personal information, which suggests that we decide for ourselves what personal information is. Okay, so my personal information is what I don't want to have shared. And that might be different from someone else's information that they don't want to have shared. So there's a suggestion here that kind of it depends on the context and the perspective. And here, Nissenbaum sort of takes this to describe privacy as control over flows of information, personal information as defined by me. So, this might be defined as... I've lost a slide. Where's my slide? Privacy in context. Sorry, my slides are a bit out of order. As privacy in context. Okay? So this idea that I decide what information I want to have shared about me and what I don't want to have shared about me might be understood as privacy in context. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Okay? But one important thing to note is that definitions of privacy are culturally specific. Okay, they depend on particular context, and there's a reference in the handout, the module outline, by Yuan et al., which is a study of privacy in China, and she argues that the kind of mainstream scholarly idea about what privacy is based on the experience of it in Western democracies. And what she points out is that there is no single Chinese word accompanying all of the meanings that are attached to the English word privacy. So there's no exact overlap between a Chinese word and the English word privacy. So if you want to think about privacy in the Chinese context, they argue you need to think about China's history and the extent to which people maybe didn't have a lot of privacy in the domestic setting, and the current transition to a more kind of individualized market economy and how that might change definitions of privacy. So definitions of privacy change over time, and they are also different in different contexts. So it's not a set thing, it's a fluid and changing thing. So for a lot of scholars we get the argument that privacy still matters, okay? So I'll give you a couple of examples here. There's lots more that you can follow up on. So Dan Trottier, in his book Social Media as Surveillance, he says that social media platforms are characterised by, the term that he uses is interiority. So like they feel interior, like the intimate, private stuff that goes on inside ourselves. He says they're perceived as spaces for psychological comfort. If you think about an exchange, about something minute that has happened in your everyday life and you're offloading, getting angry, seeking comfort, there is kind of a psychological comfort element to social media. He says what happens there is private. He describes social media as being similar to dwellings or to homes. We spend a lot of time in them, we use them extensively, and we depend on our dwellings or homes for privacy. The walls of dwellings are supposed to shield us from public scrutiny, but the walls of social media platforms expose us to public scrutiny, right? That's where we write stuff and stuff gets shared. So they are spaces for sharing personal detail, forming relationships, and the stuff that we share we often would consider to be private, personal and intimate. So you get a technical definition of what is private and what isn't private on social media and other online digital platforms, which is basically that if I can access it without inputting a password or without going around a firewall, then it's public. Okay, so if people haven't made their Facebook pages private, if I can see them, then technically it's public. But what these writers are kind of disputing is that kind of technical definition matters to people. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if technically this is public. It feels private. It feels like a private space, and that matters when we think about whether something is private or not. I also talked about Dana Boyd's work, which I would argue aims to show that privacy does still matter to young people. It's just different. And I think I also said in the first week that she talks about being private in public as how you might kind of describe what happens on social media. So, okay, it's technically public, just like, a town square might be technically public, but I can still have a private conversation in that technically public space. So for her, that's being private in public. And also she makes this distinction between being public and being in public. So I might be in a square, but unless I stand on a stage with a microphone, which would be being public, saying something publicly, I still want to keep my conversation private. So she sort of invites us to think more deeply about a sort of simplistic distinction between private and public, and to think of different ways of formulating the relationship between the two of them. So this brings us to the work of Helen Nissenbaum, who her book is called Privacy in Context, Technology, Policy and the Integrity of Social Life. So what she argues is that people disclose personal information about themselves in particular contexts, and in doing so they have particular expectations about what will happen to that information. Okay, so being a social media researcher, I kind of know that nothing is really private. So if I said something on Facebook, I don't have many expectations of privacy, right? Me personally. If I say something to my doctor, I do have expectations of privacy. So the context in which I reveal the information brings with it particular expectations about whether that information will or will not be shared, about what will happen to that information, okay? So the context in which I reveal information matters. I've got particular expectations. If those expectations are ignored, she says it's a violation of people's data rights, okay? So people expect their Facebook posts, their WeChat conversations, whatever it is, to stay private. If we ignore that expectation, it's a violation of people's data rights. And this is a really important phrase for her, which has been adopted by quite a few other people in studies since then, which is, she argues that we need to retain the contextual integrity when it comes to sharing data and information flows, okay? So contextual integrity means respecting my expectations of what will happen to my data when I share it in a particular space. That's contextual integrity. If you ignore it, then you're failing to stick to this principle of contextual integrity. And this helps her make sense of the fact that the same person might be happy for data to be shared in a particular context and unhappy in another context. And that's because of my expectations of contextual integrity. So if I go to the doctor with a problem, I don't expect him to share it with anyone. But if I take part in a health survey where I reveal information about myself, I expect that to get aggregated and to be used to, in some kind of context. So I don't mind the information I put in the health survey being shared. I do mind my doctor sharing it, and yet I said the same thing to both people. Okay, it's the context that matters. So what you can see across all these arguments is that privacy is still a social norm, Nissenbaum would say, and Dana Boyd would say, and Dan Trottier would say. It's just that the conditions have changed, and we need to sort of think differently about privacy to how we have historically. And these issues, it's not the case that they matter less in an age of social media data mining. In fact, they matter more because of the volume and the velocity and the scale and the variety of data that is produced and mined and aggregated. So what some writers argue is that mundane everyday activities undergo moral transformation. They become like a morally different issue when they're sort of digitized and turned into data and aggregated and mined and shared, and kind of made available. And so some writers use this really interesting example of Google's Maps attempts to take photographs of everywhere. Okay, this is a sort of data aggregation exercise. But what if they take a photo of a man leaving a strip club, of a child smoking, of a topless sunbather? So what, the argument is these are mundane everyday activities, but they transformed morally through the act of turning them into data through things like Google's mapping activities. And these are issues around privacy. Okay, so there's a kind of relationship between morality and privacy, some people argue. So some important concepts in debates about privacy. This concept of the privacy paradox, which quite a lot of researchers have written about, which basically says that I say I care about privacy and yet I act in ways that make it look like I don't care. So I say that I want my privacy, I respect it, it's important to me, and yet I share stuff all over the place without caring about who can see it. And that's called the privacy paradox. There's a paradox there between what I say I care about and how I behave. For me, this concept of the privacy paradox raises the question about what do people understand about their own online privacy. And one of my big arguments is we don't know enough about what people understand. But there have been some surveys. So Joseph Turow has carried out several surveys in the US, one in 2005, one in 2009, and another one last year, 2015. He found in 2005 that around 50% of people didn't know that websites share their data. I think we should ask the same question today. I'd be really interested to know if that figure changes. In 2009, he found that 62% of participants in his survey believed that if a website had a privacy policy, it wouldn't share their data. So they believed that the existence of a privacy policy was equivalent to a website saying we keep things private for you, which isn't the case. A privacy policy can say you've got no privacy, but it's still a policy, it's still a written policy. A researcher called Kay Martin carried out a study of users' engagements with privacy policies. What she did is she asked participants to read the privacy policies of platforms on which they frequently went. And what she did was she passed around some scenarios to people. Okay, so the scenario would say, on this platform, this happened to your data, and she asked people, A, is this problematic? Is it a problem? And B, is it within the realms of the policy? Is the company doing what it said it would do in its policy? And she found that in every case, people said yes, it is problematic, and no, the company isn't doing what it said it would do. whereas in fact all of the scenarios meant the company was doing what it said it would do. I hope you can follow this, right? So people thought the companies were breaking their privacy policies, but they weren't in any of the cases. And what she concludes from this is not that people just misunderstood the privacy policies, but that they bring with them substantive expectations about what a privacy policy should do. Okay? So it's not about what it said it would do, it's what people thought it should do that influenced them deciding whether they thought it was within the realms of the policy or not. So this is really interesting. You know, it doesn't matter what a privacy policy says. People have expectations about what it should be doing. And other questions that I think arise from this privacy paradox are questions of do people care about privacy? Do people have privacy management strategies, for example? So Dana Boyd and Esther Hargitay in 2010 did a study of around 1,000 university students, and they found that almost all of them managed their privacy settings on Facebook. This was just on Facebook. So almost everyone had taken some action to manage their privacy settings. So they conclude this: far from being nonchalant and unconcerned about privacy matters, the majority of young adult users of Facebook are engaged with managing their privacy settings on the site to at least some extent. It's really important to note that controlling your privacy is complicated. So not controlling it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't care. It could be that it's too hard for you to do anything. So many online digital platforms, not just social media, on which we share data, their settings are public by default, and you have to act to make them more private. And a lot of people don't know how to do that, and even if they did, it doesn't guarantee your privacy in a few ways that I'll talk about. So other things that matter, the other concepts that matter in relation to these debates about privacy is the distinction between social privacy and institutional privacy. Okay, so this is social privacy is defined as controlling which people within your own networks get access to your information, and institutional privacy is about the mining of personal information by governments and commercial organisations, by institutions. So social privacy is about privacy in my personal world, and the other is about institutions. And quite a lot of studies, which I personally would argue are a bit flawed and imperfect in the way they were done, but a lot of people argue that what people care about, especially young people, is social privacy and not institutional privacy. So one of Dana Boyd's argument is that people seek privacy from those who hold power over them, and in the case of young people it's their teachers and their parents. So that's why they're more bothered about social privacy than about institutional privacy. So another important concept, and a reason why ensuring your privacy is complicated, is this notion of networked privacy, which Dana Boyd talks about in her book quite extensively, and in a few of the articles that she's written. So this is an anecdote, a story that gets told a lot in social media research. So two students went to the University of Texas, okay? They were both gay, and they had tried very hard to conceal their sexual orientation from their strict religious parents, adjusting the privacy settings on Facebook to keep certain details private. But when they went to the University of Texas, when they joined the university, they joined a gay choir called the Queer Chorus. And having joined that, the person that managed the Queer Chorus added them to its Facebook page. And that became visible to the friends and networks of the two students. So their parents found out about their sexual identity that way and responded in very negative and upsetting ways. And this is used as an example of networked privacy. I'm not completely in control of my own privacy on Facebook, because I could be a real expert social media user and really lock down my privacy, but if my friend isn't and doesn't lock down her privacy and she shares something that I've shared, then the world can see it. So you're not in control of your privacy because social media are networked. So this concept of networked privacy is really important. So I think there's quite a lot of arguments here around, why it is, even if you did really care about your privacy, how it's difficult to kind of control it. Okay, and I'm going to come back to something related to that when we talk about rights at the end. A couple of other questions that get asked a lot around privacy in relation to social media. How do you legislate? How do you govern to ensure that there is privacy on social media? So lots of legal scholars are interested in this, and this is really not my area of expertise, so I'm not talking about that such a lot. Also, what I haven't got on the slide is a lot of technical people are interested in how do you build systems that ensure privacy. So there's technical questions, there's legal questions, and there's questions around how people behave and people's behaviour. So there's all sorts of different ways of coming at privacy questions. In relation to the sort of legal stuff, I would recommend a starting point, if you're interested, is the blog of this guy, Michael Zimmer, and I think it's michaelzimmer.org, but you can look him up. He blogs a lot, so it's quite user-friendly stuff about governance and online privacy and how you sort of legislate. And then other big questions about, is privacy a fundamental human right? Are social media data private or are they public? So there's all sorts of questions that we could ask if we wanted to sort of address issues of privacy. But I'm going to move on to surveillance now, okay, just so that we cover all of the content for this week. So one of the things that's really interesting about the relationship between debates about privacy and debates about surveillance is that some people that are interested in the surveillance angle of social media data mining argue that, by focusing on privacy and by talking about individuals' responsibilities for managing their own privacy and taking care of their own privacy, we end up ignoring the kind of big social impacts of social media data mining, which are that they result in more and more surveillance. Okay, so surveillance studies people are quite critical of that focus on privacy. So there's lots of examples of social media data being used as a form of surveillance, and the big spectacular Edward Snowden revelations about the activities of the US government, the UK government and security agencies is one really sort of large-scale example, but there are plenty of other examples as well. So a lot of people argue that social media data mining is a new form of surveillance. We've seen already Daniel Trottier's book is called Social Media as Surveillance, and Christian Fuchs, who I talked about a bit last week, he writes a lot about surveillance as well. And another person who writes a lot about digital technologies and surveillance, and including social media data mining, is this guy called Mark Andreevich. And he's been talking about this for a long time, kind of pre-social media platforms. So there's lots of references to his work at the end here. This is just one book that he wrote in 2013, but in 2004 he was talking about how interactive digital technologies allowed previously unmonitored activities to be monitored because they had become kind of digitized and networked. And so he saw that people's digital communication was increasingly under the gaze of a surveillance society. And in this book he writes about all sorts of things: sentiment analysis, which is a kind of social media data mining, opinion mining, neuromarketing. He's got a lot to say about drones and other ICTs, and he's arguing that they all subject our actions to surveillance scrutiny. So yes, the drone, don't know if you've seen any, and know anyone that's got one? See, I went to a toy shop with my children and there were drones flying around, and I don't know if you know Sylvanian family, which is really freaky little rabbits and things, and I said, oh, that drone's cute, look at that freaky rabbit. And my son pointed out that I should be saying the opposite. That rabbit is cute, look at that freaky drone, because drones surveil. You know, they are increasingly used in surveillance operations. And so the drone becomes a kind of metaphor for kind of digitalised surveillance, not just social media surveillance. So the article that you're asked to read for this topic, he's writing with Kelly Gates, and they talk about drones, and they talk about their ability to capture all of the data all of the time. Okay, so not only are digital technologies used as a part of surveillance society, they're transforming surveillance. So surveillance changes because of datafication and drone type technologies and the possibility of capturing all of the data all of the time and storing it forever. So in the article they draw on a definitions of surveillance by Murakami Wood and others as purposeful, routine, systematic and focused attention paid to personal details for the sake of control, entitlement, management, influence or protection. So it's purposeful, it has a purpose, it's systematic, it's focused. It's not all of the data all of the time, it's selected. It's selected. There are targets for surveillance in these old definitions of surveillance. It's planned and carried out according to a schedule that is rational, not merely random. So this is how key surveillance scholars have understood surveillance for a very long time. And what Andreevich and Gates are arguing is that that is not the case anymore in an age of social media, data mining and other kinds of datafication and big data surveillance. So instead, if you're gathering all of the data all of the time and storing it forever, it's much more speculative and opportunistic. It's total, it's not targeted like it used to be, it's not focused attention. So this idea that some data gathered today might be relevant for surveillance next month, because we might aggregate it with some data gathered next month and it might tell us something meaningful. This makes it speculative, but also justifies this kind of totalizing form of surveillance. And I showed these words in one of the early lectures about datafication as a kind of evidence that there is this belief that we must gather all of the data all of the time. So this is by the CIA's Chief Technology Officer. The value of any piece of information is only known when you can connect it with something else that arrives at a future point in time. Since you can't connect the dots you don't have, it drives us into a mode of fundamentally gathering everything and hanging on to it forever. So Andreevich and Gates' is argument, also borne out by the other articles in the special issue that they're introducing, is that surveillance changes in times of big data and datafication. And very importantly, they point out that if you would like to surveil and gather all of the data all of the time, there are serious infrastructural challenges there, right? You need a massive database, you need big infrastructure if you want to participate in surveilling. And who's got that? Social media platforms and other platforms, right? They've got the infrastructure, they've got the databases, so they're actually really important actors in this changing surveillance society. And they point to a list of the 10 largest databases in the world. And they include things like the Library of Congress, sort of massive global databases. But number 8 is Amazon and number 7 is YouTube. Okay, so social media platforms are well placed to participate in this new form of surveillance of all of the data all of the time. And one of the things that Andreevich and Gates argue, drawing on others, is that it's really hard to study infrastructures. It's really hard to know what they look like, to get access to them, to find out exactly what's going on in relation to surveillance. Okay, so in addition to that surveillance that we've talked about, which is kind of top-down, major corporations and organisations surveilling us as ordinary, non-powerful citizens, other types of surveillance happen because of social media. And here's some important concepts in relation to that. So Alice Marwick talks about social surveillance. She argues that it's reciprocal. We surveil each other. I keep a check on what you're doing, you keep a check on what I'm doing, because of this kind of public display of everything on social media. She kind of seems to suggest that it's a good thing, which is interesting, and you should talk about that in your seminars, whether you think it's a good thing. And it's not dissimilar. It's similar to an earlier piece of work by Albrechtsen, which talks about participatory surveillance, we're all involved in it, lateral surveillance, which means kind of peer-to-peer, or even self-surveillance. Okay, so I better not post something that makes me look like that on social media, because people might think something about me, so I'm surveilling myself as part of these activities. And a really important concept is the concept of surveillance. So surveillance, sur is French for kind of on top, and su is French for underneath. So it's the opposite of surveillance. So instead of the powerful surveilling ordinary people, it's about ordinary people using devices to monitor what the powerful are doing. And you can see this in cases of police aggression in the US. People are using videos on their phones to capture examples of police brutality. And this drawing is done by the 6-year-old daughter of the guy that coined the term surveillance. So I think it says it all. That's surveillance and that's surveillance, bottom up rather than top down. So some of the surveillance practices that some of these writers are talking about raise serious questions in relation to human rights, liberties and social justice. So there's really, major kind of social concerns here. So I'm going to turn to one of those now. I think there's a really tight linkage between debates around surveillance and debates around rights. So what are your digital data rights? Okay. One place to find out what your rights are is to turn to the terms and conditions or privacy policies of the platforms on which we're sharing information. Okay. And you were asked, your seminars are next week, but you're asked for the seminar to read the terms and conditions of one platform that you regularly go on. Okay. So when I was preparing this lecture, I thought, okay, I've done it before in the past. I've read some terms and conditions. I'll read some now to see what the experience is like. Where shall I go? So I thought I'll go to Flickr. Went to the Flickr homepage, scrolled down to the bottom of the page where it said terms and conditions. And I was doing this in my house up a hill in Sheffield. And this is the page that came up when I clicked on terms and conditions. It's in German. I wasn't in Germany and I don't speak German, so this was my first attempt to check out some terms and conditions, so I gave up on that. I thought I'll have a look on Twitter, right? So I'm not totally clueless here. I know that links to terms and conditions and privacy policies are normally at the bottom of the page, so I'll go to the bottom of the page. But there is no bottom of the page in Twitter, is there? There is no bottom of the page. You never ever get to the bottom of the page. So I kept going for a while, but in the end I opened a new tab and I Googled Twitter's terms and conditions, and that took me somewhere eventually where I was intending to be. And this is important because it's hard to read terms and conditions and privacy policies, right? Not just for the reasons I've shown here that you can't find them or that they're in the wrong language, but for various different reasons. I've done some research about this that I'll talk about in a couple of weeks. But, they're spread around over different pages. They're in very legal language. And so it is people's failure to read privacy policies and terms and conditions that is part of this privacy paradox that I was talking about before. Some figures say that only about 20% of people read terms and conditions and privacy policies. I think that's quite high, 20%. I would think it was possibly lower than that. But it's not straightforward to do it. And there's a study by someone called Florencia Marotta Wergler, whose name is there and homepage is indicated on the slide, in which she read the privacy policies of 260 websites on which people share personal information, so including social media platforms, but also dating sites and message boards. And I'm really glad she did that, because I now don't have to read 260 privacy policies, which would be, I'm sure, a very painful experience. So she found that they did not meet what she describes as benchmark standards, and there's a very full legal explanation of what she means by that, by benchmark standards. She found that key terms were rarely defined. Okay, so a privacy policy might say that I'm going to share your data with an affiliate or with a third party. It doesn't tell you what that means or who I'm referring to. Mitigation phrases and hedge terms are frequently used. That means phrases like, from time to time, we might do this, at our discretion, we might do that. They're vague terms, so that you don't actually know what I'm going to do, because I'm using these vague terms, which in legal terms are called mitigation phrases and hedge terms. She found that there was an average of 20 such phrases in a privacy policy and a maximum of 53. Okay? She found that policies change frequently, sometimes 30 times a year. That's more frequently than every 2 weeks. So you might feel really pleased that you have now read the terms and conditions or privacy policy of a social media platform and you now know what's going on. You've got to read it again in 2 weeks because it might change. Some of these companies let you know when they've changed their policies, but not all of them do. So I love this study because I think it shows that the existence of privacy statements does almost nothing to communicate to us about the privacy of our personal data on social media platforms. They're not clear, they change a lot, they're vague, they're hard to find. Okay, so that's one place where you might think you would find out what your rights are. Other places where you can find out what your rights are in law. I'm focusing on the UK case here because here we are in the UK. So the UK has a Data Protection Act. It's influenced by European legislation. The second bullet point, the European Data Protection Directive, is the current European legislation, and for quite some time they've been working on future, soon-to-be current legislation called the General Data Protection Regulation. And I've included Wikipedia links here because this is complex legal stuff. We're not legal experts, and I think we need some plain English definitions here. So the point of this forthcoming legislation is that it intends to strengthen and unify data protection for individuals within the EU. So there's been kind of complicated stuff around US-based firms and what they are obliged to do in relation to European citizens' data if they are not actually based in the EU. So this new legislation is intended to address those problems. Okay, so a person's right of access to personal data is a central feature of this legislation, and arguably is the most important of what are described as ARCO data protection rights. Okay, so you have a right to access data that is held about you. You've got a right to rectify it, change it if it's inaccurate. You've got a right to cancel it, ask that it's withdrawn, and you've got a right to oppose it. Okay, so a range of rights. So the individual has a right to know what data is being collected about them, by whom, how it's being processed, and to whom it is disclosed. We have rights to inspect the data, to ensure that it's accurate, to complain to an independent authority if we don't think it is. Okay? So that looks good, doesn't it? There was a really fantastic study by two colleagues in sociology, Clive Norris and Xavier Louari, which was part of this big European-wide project, where what they did was they experimented with exercising data rights. So in 10 European countries, they got people to try to exercise their rights. So, you've got a right to know what data's collected about you, who it's been shared with, and what it says. That's your right. Well, let's see if it's actually possible to enact that right, okay, so exercise that right. So they said they attempted to send access requests to 184 organisations in 10 European countries, including social media platforms. So they wanted to know, what data you hold about me? Can I see the data? What have you done with it? Is it being shared? And their findings tell us a lot about whether the existence of a right in law means anything at all. In 20% of the cases, they couldn't even find who to talk to, right? So they might have been on an online shopping platform and they wanted to ask, what data do you hold about me? And they couldn't even find who to ask it of, right? In 43% of cases where they said, please can you send me the data that you hold about me, they didn't get it. And in 56% of cases, when they asked, who do you share my data with, they didn't get a response. And in some cases, some of the organisations said to them, it would be illegal of us to answer your questions. Well, Javier is a legal scholar. He's got a PhD in law, and all of the people that were working on this project were kind of experts in the field. They were trying to stick within the law and being told by organisations that it would be unlawful to do so. So it tells us a lot about why people get angry about surveillance and data surveillance. There's a lot more findings in this. I'm just highlighting some of them here. And it's not surprising then, I think, that people get active in data rights groups. So Open Rights Group, Electronic Frontier Foundation are two campaigning, lobbying groups that are lobbying for better and better implemented data rights and data legislation. And I'm going to say more about these kinds of organisations in the final week, where we look at kind of alternatives and activism and advocacy in relation to data and data mining. So just to point out that in your next session on the 31st of October, not the seminars that are linked to this subject, but the next one, you're asked to read a chapter from David Beer's book, an online article, and to experiment with either the Facebook demetricator or to look at a project about values and value, which are both about the numbers through which we experience social media. So the Facebook demetricator is loads of fun. You have to be on Facebook to be able to download it, but I think it's a revealing experience. Okay? So other than that, here's hundreds of thousands of references which are online. I don't expect you to be able to read them. Look, there's 2 pages of them, but they are the references that I've talked about in the lecture today, and they'll help you find out more about these issues of privacy and surveillance and rights. Okay? Thank you very much. Turning the recorders off.